so happy we alive.
Adult individuals. Now, some people on both the left and the right think that if you leave moral decisions to the individual, you must think they're unimportant, since you're not making a collective decision about them. But that's wrong. It's backwards. It's because these decisions are important that they have to be left up to the individual conscience. If what we were talking about was choosing the right fork, then there'd be no reason not to have central direction. Who cares? Choosing the right fork. But we're not talking about choosing the right fork. We're talking about choosing what to believe and whom to love and how to treat our friends and our children and what to achieve and what to create and where to live and what to do for a living and how and where and with whom. And those are decisions that are important, which is why they need to be made by individuals. Now, I don't have to tell you too much about some of the right-wing views of whether people should be able to make these choices, but I want to point to a couple of prominent people who are not right-wingers. Hillary Clinton goes around saying things like, there is no such thing as other people's children. Now, it would be bad enough if she wanted collectively to raise all of our children. The fact is, she doesn't think just children as defined as under 18 should be raised by the collective. She thinks there are a lot of rules for those of us who are over 18. Al Gore said once, he was speaking at the White House Conference on Character Building, and don't they need that? And he said, we should never want the government to be like the parents, but rather it should be like the grandparents. It's not so hands-on, but still would have a nurturing role. He thinks adult individuals are like the grandchildren of the federal government. Meanwhile, I noticed a couple of intellectuals recently saying almost precisely the same thing from the opposite sides of the political spectrum. The left-wing writer Robert Kuttner wrote a book that basically complains that Americans have an excess amount of choice. While the right-wing pundit William Crystal writes, conservatism's fundamental mandate is to take on the sacred cow of liberalism, choice. So both Kuttner and Crystal think the problem in our world is that we have too much choice, that adults get to make too many choices in their lives. So we're talking about making people children. We're talking about taking choices away from them. How do they make us children? What kinds of choices do they want to take? Well, I could spend the whole speech on that, but let me just point out, there are some people who think we should be drafted into military service or drafted into non-military but compulsory service. There are people who want to censor the internet or have speech codes regulating what you can say on college campuses and eventually probably other places. There are people who don't think we should have freedom of contract. I think that's a classic example. There are some ways in which you protect children from the possibility of making contracts that they don't understand. You don't protect adults from that sort of thing. You protect children. They want to take away from us the freedom to choose our schools, the freedom to choose our medicines, the freedom to choose the size of oranges we will buy. You may not realize it, it's illegal to sell oranges of certain sizes. The freedom to choose whom to hire and whom to fire. And most specifically for this conference, they want to take away our self-ownership, our right to control our bodies, to decide what we will do about drugs and sex and tobacco and seat belts and all these other personal decisions that matter to us, may matter very much to us, may have bad consequences for us, but are our business and only regard us. And although it rarely actually comes to this in civilized modern society, we need to remember that behind every ridiculous regulation stands the willingness to enforce it with violence if necessary. And we should think about that. You should think about it every time you watch the television news. You hear politicians talk about anything, family leave policy, social regulation, revenue enhancement, pro-family legislation. What they need is that some people are going to force other people to do something they wouldn't choose to do if they weren't being forced. And if those other people resist, and as I said, it rarely comes to this in civilized modern society because the fact is we do obey. If they pass these laws, most of us go along with them. We do what we're told. But if they resist, my friend Paul spent 6 months in jail because he refused to fill out a postcard telling the government how to draft him. A guy named David Lucas in South Carolina bought a oceanfront lot, after which the legislature passed a law saying he couldn't build a house on that lot. The property he had spent $1 million for was suddenly worthless. Stroke of a pen. A woman named Sharon Bottoms across the river here in Virginia had her son taken away from her because she's a lesbian. And the court ultimately said, yes, it can be very bad for the child. There's a lot of prejudice against lesbians, as demonstrated by the fact that they're taking your child away from her. A man named Tom Spees in Indiana, I think, had some federal bureaucrats show up at his office one day and say, we'd like to come in and look at all your wage and hour records. He said, am I accused of anything? No, you're not accused of anything. Do you have a search warrant? No, I don't have a search warrant. He ended up going to jail, briefly, only briefly, because he said, you can't come in if I'm not accused of a crime. You can't look at my records unless I'm accused of something. A woman named Alexandra White in California didn't like the idea that the government was going to put a halfway house in her neighborhood. She thought it might be dangerous. They had some public discussions. The Department of Housing and Urban Development came down and demanded that she and her colleagues submit to the government every email, every flyer, every letter, records of every phone call, every public address, a chilling effect on public discussion. 15 years ago in Utah, a man named John Singer took his kids out of the public school. The government didn't approve of that at the time, although homeschooling laws have certainly been liberalized. Agents came out to inquire why John Singer didn't have his children in school. John Singer ended up dead with a bullet in his back. I don't know what happened, I don't know what kind of confrontation there was, but the bullet was in his back. And then we all know what happened at Waco. Some people that I probably wouldn't really want to spend a lot of time with went off and didn't ask me to spend any time with them. Lived in a place of their own and ended up getting raided by the government. People shot, and eventually the place burned down. And that's what power can do, not only to the victims, but to the perpetrators. I wonder how the people who do these things live with themselves. It must be difficult for them, as well as for the people they've done it to. So we should never forget that when people talk about policy, what we're really talking about is real people being told to do things that they don't want to do, and ultimately we're threatening to use violence against them if they don't do what we say. So I want to stop talking about power for a minute and talk about freedom. When we talk about marijuana and freedom, it's hard to know where to start. But here's maybe one good place, and that is, where does the federal government get the power to prohibit marijuana? Well, I'm going to answer that, or not. Liberals and libertarians, ACLU people, for instance, and libertarians associated with the libertarian movement, usually discuss the Constitution in terms of rights. They say, does the government's action infringe on some enumerated or unenumerated right of individuals? But the emphasis on rights may be misplaced and sometimes even counterproductive. There's no question the Constitution protects a lot of our rights. It's important. But at bottom, the Constitution is a document through which the founders authorized the federal government's powers. In fact, it was 2 years after ratification of the Constitution before we even had a Bill of Rights. We cannot imagine that we had no rights from 1789 to 1791. Through the Constitution, we delegated certain powers to the federal government. We, the people, delegated certain of our powers to the federal government. We enumerated those powers in the Constitution. Look in the Constitution, you'll see a list of them. It tells what powers the federal government has. And by enumerating them, we made clear that the federal government's powers are limited, because we didn't enumerate every power. And we didn't say, you have all power. We said, here are the powers you have. And after a short period, it was decided that it would make sense to add a Bill of Rights to that Constitution. James Madison said, for greater caution, we're going to add a Bill of Rights. And so they listed a lot of rights. And then, because no one could enumerate all the rights that free people have, Congress added the Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Not granted by the Constitution, retained by the people when they created the Constitution. And then they added the 10th Amendment, which reserves to the states or to the people all the powers not explicitly